Welcome to a new edition of the Famous Interviews with Joe Dimino. On this episode, we talk with author and professional coach Brady Ross. He lives near Edmond, Oklahoma with his wife and 2 young children. He's passionate about helping unlock new sources of motivation to pursue the goals that matter most to them. He also loves helping people learn how to win at work without sacrificing their personal health and well-being. Recently, he released his first book, 7 Steps to Dominate Your Day and Crush Your Goals. He's got a great story. Enjoy.
Great to meet you. And, before we get into your life as an author and a professional coach, looking at the calendar right now probably brings the world PTSD because 3 years ago, everything just ground to a halt. And I'm curious how that pandemic time period affected the way, how you survived it and how it's affected the way that you conduct business now and even live your life.
Yeah, it's funny, for me and maybe for a lot of people, the pandemic started around the time that Rudy Gobert with the Utah Jazz tested positive, and there was the game in Oklahoma City that was supposed to happen that got postponed at the last second. And I was at that game that night. I vividly remember, my brother and I got tickets. I had never sat that close to the court before. And, it was an important game for playoff seeding, and we were so excited. And then all of a sudden the game didn't start on time, and they've got the halftime performers coming out earlier, and they're trying to fill time. And then eventually they announce that the game's not going to happen. And so we go home and we're just wondering what in the world is going on. And I remember telling my brother as we're driving home, if and this was before the announcement came out that Gobert had COVID, but I was like, they can't continue to play if they're concerned about the possibility of someone having it and they can't play a game when everyone's already there. We're not going to see any games for a while. And then sure enough, he tested positive, the NBA shut down, and then we had restaurants and businesses and things like that following suit. But, for me in my life, I think it was a really good reset. A big part of my story has to do with working in ministry, struggling with the balance between my work life and my family life, and then actually losing my job in a pretty unexpected manner in 2019. So COVID happened about 6 to 8 months after that. And so for 6 weeks, my job at the time primarily involved being out of the house, being in grocery stores. And for a period of time, I chose not to do that. I'm thankful that there were people who continued to shop and continued to, be in the stores to help people who couldn't expose themselves. But I made the choice for me and my family just to stay home during that time. And so all of this to say, I guess it really reminded me of what was important in life. I recognized that, and I don't want to diminish, anyone who had significant, financial losses or lost a loved one during that time. But for me, I was able to take a step back, re-engage with my family, kind of enjoy a slower pace of life for a while, and just sort of reimagine what was really important and what was consistent throughout my life.
It's interesting because I think there's almost this buyer's remorse. I hear this from people that there's almost they kind of feel weird about saying it was a time of recalibration and it was good, because I think that's just the way it was for a lot of people. The world finally slowed down. We've always been at a frantic pace as humans, especially in this country. So I totally understand. What's weird about your basketball story is that winter, I remember getting my son really into hockey, and we were watching a Blues game. And I don't know if you remember this, but one of the players had an aneurysm and collapsed, after the first period. And it was a big deal. And all the players were freaking out, and they canceled the game. And I remember I came out. I was with my son, putting him to bed, and I came out and I said, they just canceled the hockey game. It was unheard of. They just canceled the game. And I wasn't questioning the medical abnormality, none of that, just the fact that you never see anything get canceled. And man, were we in for a ride. Everything was off, and it's weird to think that. And, and there's people that on the coast had a gut feeling because there was more people of international descent, so they kind of sniffed it out early. So it's interesting how it all played out, for sure.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, and as you're talking about this hockey story, which I'll be honest, I don't remember when that happened, but my mind goes to DeMar Hamlin back in January and being glued to the TV that night, just thinking, I've never seen anything like this before. And as, concerned as you are, and as much as that shakes your reality, at the same time, you can't look away because it's you have no framework for anything like that happening.
Yeah, the weird thing about that game is that I was kind of at a point during the season, because of course the Chiefs won the Super Bowl and we're here in Kansas City. But I remember looking at that game thinking, and this is my honest thing, I was like, I just did not think that Kansas City could beat either of them. So that game had big implications for the fact that we were going to look at what was going to happen. And so it was wild when that happened. And I don't know, I was really studying how the broadcasters were handling that, because there's been things that have happened. I remember when I was a kid and that earthquake happened in Oakland, and, they all had a kind of scramble, but this was pretty strange on a number of levels. It was pretty unprecedented the way it happened and the way they interacted with it. But Brady, to get to the essence of who you are and what you do daily, I want to put you hypothetically in front of a bunch of grade school kids at a career day, and one of the kids is going to look up and ask you, what do you do for a living? How do you answer them?
This thought has been on my mind a lot lately, because in a way I struggle with that question when I get it from other people, not necessarily from grade schoolers, because I'm not in that context very often, if ever. But I've had to wrestle with, like, what do I do? Do I tell people what I do a little bit of and what I want to do more of, or do I tell people what my primary source of income is right now? I think to boil it down to its essence, I would say that I help people get motivated. And that sounds like a very, ambiguous or very vague idea, but I think what I've learned from some of my life experiences, and especially some of the things that I've been working on lately, is that a lot of people feel like motivation eludes them. They look at motivation as something that some people have and others don't. And I'll hear people say things like, well, I'm just not that motivated, or if only I was motivated, then I can do this or that. And the more that I thought about that, I realized motivation is not something that we have in different quantities. You and I have the exact same amount of motivation because we're able to make voluntary choices. Like, both of us making the choice to be on this phone call right now is a reflection of the motivation that we have. The problem that people have is not a lack of motivation, but it's the direction or the focus of their motivation. And what makes motivation challenging is that a lot of times the decisions that we face that are difficult involve competing motivations. But what's cool is that as we acknowledge that there are multiple motivators or multiple drives that come into play as we make these decisions about what we'll do or about how we spend our time, once we acknowledge that that's happening, we take the first step towards being able to control or shift our motivations to serve not just our short-term comfort, but our long-term goals and our long-term aspirations.
It's interesting. It made me think, when you were talking about that, it made me think about that quote from Mark Twain where he said, I don't regret what I did in my life, I regret what I didn't do. And that's really what it comes down to. It's that allocation of what do you want to do with your life and how do you want to live it? Because, really, it's all about choice, and whether you do it or not is solely up to you. But that's interesting the way you said it, us making the choice to be on this call together. That's emblematic of a lot. So, you're obviously somebody that is a motivator. That takes a lot out of a person. So let's go back to your beginnings, where you were born and raised, and how some of these seeds got into you as you grew up and became who you are today. How did that happen?
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I think that my story reflects a lot of people's experience, and that I have not always been as in tune with my motivation as I am right now. It really started around the time when I was 18 years old. I was out of my parents' house. I had just gone to college. I weighed almost 300 pounds. I was not the best student. For a while, I was able to get through school just on being naturally intelligent. And then you reach a point, latter half of high school going into college, where, your natural abilities are only going to get you so far. You've got to study and apply yourself to take things to the next level. And I didn't see things that way. I thought that people who made better grades than me were just more intelligent than I was. And I thought that people who were in better shape had more favorable genetics. And I think that all of this came from a place where I was either unable or maybe unwilling to take responsibility for my actions. And there was never like a defining moment or a come to Jesus type experience where I realized that I was going down the wrong path and I needed to shift direction. Really, it was a gradual process that happened through the adoption of small daily habits that any one repetition might not have made a huge difference. But as I repeated those things over time and as they began to compound, I started to notice that I was in an entirely different place than where I was before. So to use the example of personal fitness and working out, I started going to the gym just because I had friends that were going. You know, we were freshmen living in the dorm. I had a roommate that was going to work out. I had another buddy down the hall that was going to the gym. And so I just thought, if that's what they're going to do, then that's what I should be doing as well. And it wasn't anything major at first. It was like a couple days a week, maybe 30 minutes each time. But I did that for several months. And before I knew it, I had dropped from 290 on the scale all the way down to 265. And it kind of came as a shock to me because I hadn't done anything drastically different than what I was doing before. But I guess in a way, it just goes to show you how little maybe I was doing before. And there was also this point along the way, and maybe this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think that there's an important message here. I had a day 3 or 4 months into that where I just didn't feel like going to the gym. I don't know if there was something else that I wanted to do or if I was just tired, but I did not want to go to the gym. And I don't entirely remember the thought process behind it, but I made the choice to go anyways. And I felt so good afterwards, not just physically good because of the endorphin release, but I felt mentally strong. I felt more present with the people that I was around. And a couple of things happened there. One, I recognized that exercise has benefits on your entire being and not just your physical health. But I also realized, and I think hindsight helps inform this, but I began to realize how you change a habit loop to help you accomplish whatever results or whatever outcome you're searching for. So in my mind before, I had thought if I go to the gym when I don't want to, the outcome is going to be that I'm uncomfortable, that I'm frustrated, that I feel like I'm missing out on something else. But in reality, I went to the gym and it affected my mentality and my attitude in a positive way. And that was an outcome, that was a reward that from that point on I wanted to chase. And it helps me lock in that habit in an even greater way than before. But to get back to your question about, where did this all start for me, I think it was little actions like that and the results that followed, however small they were, that taught me for the first time in my life, it's not about how smart you are. It's not about how naturally gifted you are. It's about the choices that you make, and it's about your willingness, your desire to push yourself forward and move from where you are to where you want to go. And it was just so empowering to realize, really for the first time, that I had more control and more agency over my position in life than I thought.
So who's consistently been a role model or a hero for you in your pursuits in your life?
Yeah, so I think about, both people near and far. I think about some of the people who I haven't met or I've only met once, but I've followed them, read their books, listened to their podcasts. John Acuff is one that I mentioned on a lot of the podcasts that I go on, both as a guest and in my own podcast that I host. But I love the way that John approaches goals and mindset and the way that he just wants people to be better than they are. And I think that he approaches these topics not as someone who, is an expert, although he is, but he's got a very humble approach where he's willing to share, both what works for him and then what doesn't. In terms of people closer to me, I think right along the time that I was starting to make these transformations in my life, I took a summer internship. I went to school to do ministry. And so when I was in college, I took a summer job with the church, working with the youth group. And my first boss, I actually worked for him for 2 summers, and we've stayed in touch since then. But just seeing a couple of things from him, the way that he approached his work, the way that he was diligent and organized, I think that it aligned with kind of what I was looking for in my personal life at that time as well. And so I credit him for a lot of the transformation and growth that I was able to experience, not just, in my professional life, but in all the areas of my life. And then even more than that, just seeing his commitment to doing things well. I'm naturally inclined, and this doesn't reflect well on me, but I'll just be honest, I'm naturally inclined to cut corners. I think that it has to do with my, Enneagram number, which is a 3. I think that it has to do with just my desire to like get things done and cross things off my list. But I would rather, in a lot of cases, get something done quickly than approach it from a very detail-oriented perspective and make sure that everything is as good as it can possibly be. And he didn't approach things that way. He didn't do anything halfway. And it was so frustrating to me sometimes in the moment because I would feel like something was good enough that he would ask for improvement or he would ask for adjustments. And it wasn't because he was trying to like exercise authority over me. It was because he had a clear vision for what we were doing within the youth ministry, within the events that we put on. And he wanted to share that with the people, you know, like me that were working on his team in a way that we would buy in. And that was challenging in the moment, but I'm so thankful for it looking back because I think that, especially at that point in my life, I needed that example from someone else. And I can see now how, you know, I may not always do that perfectly, but it's something that stuck with me and something that rubbed off on me.
Yeah, I get that feeling. Yeah, my stepdaughter was showing me a painting that she's been working on, and you know, when I paint myself, and I do it usually in one setting, and she's being very careful about it, and I don't do that. And it's not that I'm being slipshod and trying to put low quality out, but I just move through things. So I get it. You know, I don't know what you would call that personality identifier, but I identify with what you're talking about. So,
yeah, and it takes all types of people, right? You know, we need people like us that are going to move things forward and, you know, blaze new trails and move quickly. And then we also need the people that are going to slow us down and make sure that we're not just finishing things, but we're doing them well in the process.
Yeah, absolutely, man. So if you could meet anybody alive on the planet right now and spend some time with them, who would it be?
It's going to run in contrast to everything that we've talked about so far because I'm not going to tell you someone, you know, incredibly like intelligent or influential. I'm a big sports fan. I'm a half season ticket holder with the Oklahoma City Thunder. And so the thought of just getting to hang out with like Shai Gilgeous-Alexander or Jalen Williams, you know, that gets me excited. If I had to give you a better answer in terms of someone who has had a huge impact, there's several people. I mentioned John Acuff. He's someone that I look up to in the leadership realm, personal development realm. I would love to pick his brain. James Clear is someone else whose work has really influenced the way that I think about habits and personal development. I also follow Craig Groeschel pretty closely, you know, both coming from the ministry pastoral realm, but also having this interest in leadership and personal development. And he's just down the road in Edmond. So on the off chance that Craig is hearing this and wants to go, you know, have lunch sometime, I'd be all for that.
That's wonderful. Yeah, who was the dude that was on the team, the bigger dude with the long hair? Williams?
Ooh, Steven Adams.
Steven Adams. My son, you know, that was the one thing I did that winter when we really got into hockey. We were also getting into basketball, and since Oklahoma City was close, we would watch the games and get into it. He still references him because I think he's with Dallas now, right?
He's with the Grizzlies, yeah, and he's hurt.
Right.
I think he's out for the rest of the year, but he was a big part of their success when they were, you know, going well.
Yeah. So he always references him. He has a thing about, you know, he's on the autism spectrum, so he has a thing about the way people look, and with his long hair, he must have looked like a wrestler or something, so he can listen to him. You know,
which is funny, you know, he was drafted and he just had the mustache, and then it was like every year he came back and he had, you know, a little more either facial hair or hair on his head, and then you see where he is now.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me ask you this, you know, we learn in our lives, we get wisdom, we accumulate it. Let's say you have a dream tonight, you run into the 20-year-old version of yourself, and you could give that version of you a piece of advice based on the life that you've led and the things that you've learned so far. What would you tell your younger self?
Yeah, I would tell myself, I mean, everyone says to start sooner. It's like if I knew then what I know now, I wouldn't have waited so long to get things in motion. But I think I also would have set a lower bar for myself in terms of consistent action. And this is anyone who's read Atomic Habits by James Clear. This has his fingerprints all over it. But I think we tend to imagine that successful people do a couple of things extraordinarily well, and that's what puts them on top of their sport or their industry or whatever field it is where they're having these accomplishments. And it's the exception and not the rule. I think that people have this sort of framework because we live in a world where we have social media and we have the internet, and you can theoretically go viral overnight and become like this overnight sensation, but that doesn't happen for most people. For most of us, the way that we improve ourselves, the way that we grow our platform, whatever it might be, is through the consistent repetition of small actions. And so let's say one of the things that I'm working on, well, we'll just use the example of a podcast because, we're doing a podcast right now. I've got my podcast that I'm working on. Let's say you want to have a podcast with 100,000 listeners. And if you just take that and bite that entire chunk off immediately, that sounds overwhelming. Like, I don't even know 100,000 people. I may not know, 5,000 people. What am I going to do to get a listening for a podcast that is that large? But if you break it down into smaller pieces and think instead, well, how can I get 10 new listeners every week? That's still work. That's still going to require effort. But all of a sudden, when you look at it in that way, it becomes much more attainable. And so I think about some of the things that I've done. I'm going to turn 30 this year. So being 20 would have been almost 10 years ago for me. And over the past 10 years, I've done things like, multi-sport races. I've done a triathlon. I've written a book. I've gotten, different master's degrees and coaching certifications. And if I was approaching it as a 20-year-old based on what I know now, I may not set out in 6 months to say, well, I'm going to do all of these things right away, but I'm going to constantly be thinking about that next attainable step. And so say you want to run a triathlon, which is swimming, biking, and running. You're not going to go out and do that entire distance on day one, but what if you decide, I'm going to go run a mile today? Just giving yourself something to start with. I'm going to do that, 3-4 times this month. And the next month, I'm going to raise that to 1.5 miles each time. And you take these small steps forward that may not seem like, much progress. But if you continue to raise the bar for yourself as you become comfortable with that threshold that you set up, before you know it, you're going to be pushing new heights and you're going to be doing more than what you ever thought was possible just because of that incremental improvement. And I'll add one more thing, another John Acuff saying in here, but he always talks about how we shouldn't compare our beginning to someone else's middle. And he uses the example of if you want to be a public speaker, like if you want to go to conferences or, have some sort of stage or platform to share your message, you should not compare yourself to Brene Brown, because Brene Brown has been speaking to crowds, at, these massive TED conferences and other, keynote opportunities for 15, 20, 25 years. You can't expect yourself to be on day one where Brene Brown is right now, because that's ridiculous. All you can do is compare yourself to where you were yesterday. And if you're always trying to take that next step forward and be just a little bit better over time with consistent improvement and consistent emphasis, that's going to add up to something major in the long run. And it requires discipline and it requires patience, but it really is the best way for people to move forward.
So in everything that you've done in your life up to this point, what are you the proudest of? What puts a smile on your face?
I mean, I got to be honest with you. When you say that, the first thing I picture is my 2 kids. And it's the hardest thing I do in my life. I'll tell you, it's much easier to do things like writing and podcasting and coaching and, even working out, like doing these races and lifting weights. Like all of those things are easier than trying to figure out how am I going to convince my 4-year-old to go to bed when he would rather be doing anything else in the world. But it's also the most rewarding thing, and it really is a transformational thing as well. So I'm a person of faith. I always tell people that to me, marriage and parenting are 2 of the most sanctifying things that you can go through, because they are the things, the opportunities that force you in a major way to put someone else's wants and needs before your own. You live, you're married, you've got your spouse, and, you're obviously concerned with their needs, but they're not as obvious and they're not as urgent as maybe, having a child. But anyways, all that to say, you have your first child and your entire world flips upside down, and you're living for yourself a lot less and living for them a lot more. And it just forces you to see the world differently. It's so transformational, it's so refining, and it's hard. But I think that because it is hard and because it is so impactful, it's also incredibly rewarding. And, I tell people, I've got friends that don't have kids and they talk about, looking forward to life with kids and things like that. And I always tell them, like, yeah, you need to enjoy that time that you have before kids come into the picture. But once they arrive, as hard as it is, you will never wish that you could go back to the way that things were before. Life is more challenging, but it's also so much richer.
So everyone out there has a perception of you, your family, your friends, clients, colleagues, but you ultimately live your life. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
Who do I think that I am? I try to embody the perception of a learner. I want people to know, like, hey, these things that I come on and talk about, whether it's motivation, whether it's habits, whether it's self-transformation, I'm still in the laboratory or the workshop, just like you are. There are things that I've got pretty well dialed in that didn't happen overnight, but I feel like I'm in a good place with some of those habits. And there are also a lot of things that I have no clue about, and I'm trying to figure them out for myself, just like you are. To be real, one of those for me is work-life balance. I find it very hard to, because I love the work that I do and I'm excited about different ideas, I find it hard to shut off that part of my brain, especially working from home. It's not like I have a different physical setting to go to where it's harder to have these thoughts creep in. I find it hard to turn that off and pour into myself, pour into my family, the people around me. And so that's still something that I'm working on. But I want people to know that that's okay. Life is a journey. Self-development is a journey. You are never going to arrive at a final destination. You're always going to be working on something. And it forces you to stay humble, stay disciplined, and always be thinking about, how can I move, one step or two steps ahead of where I am right now.
So, Brady, if anyone out there wants to learn more about you, pick up any of your writing, anything related to your world, where is the best place for them to go?
Yeah, so I would point people towards my website at bradyross.com, just my name, BradyRoss.com. You'll find links for my book, for my podcast, my articles. If you're interested in doing coaching together, we can talk about that. I also have a midweek momentum newsletter that I send out on Tuesdays. The goal is to give you a little bit of motivation or inspiration to help you finish the week with the same amount of passion and purpose that you started with. I'm trying to stay off of social media. That's an intentional thing just for my own mental health and well-being. But if you want to talk more about anything that's come up on this podcast, or if you want to connect with me, there's a link that you can follow on my website to send me an email. And I would love to hear from anyone who's interested in these topics or chat further.
Beautiful, Brady. This has been great, man. I love your philosophy. I love that whole incremental leading up to where you're going, the choice, all of that. It's very refreshing and great to hear in words. So thank you for what you're doing. Thanks for opening up your world a little bit to us. I appreciate it.
Yes, thanks for having me. This was fun.
Thanks for tuning in to another famous interview with Joe Dimino, where we cover the world of art, literature, business, spirituality, music, and more from around the globe. If you want to hear more interviews, visit the Famous Interviews with Joe Dimino channel on YouTube. Subscribe to us there. You can also find us at Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and until next time.